I'm a 24-year-old guy, and this story revolves around a classic car that means the world to me, a symbol of the time I spent with my late mom. It's a vintage model she gave me right when I started high school, and since then, it's been more than just a vehicle. Growing up, that car felt like my last link to her, and I dreamed about restoring it someday as a tribute to her memory. Over the years, I managed to save up a bit here and there, working odd jobs, and making a plan to turn it into a project that would honor her. My dad knew all about it too. I'd been talking about it since I was a teenager. But things started to change after Dad remarried. A few months ago, he married a woman he'd been dating for a while, and along with her came a teenage son who's really into cars. Now, I'd always thought it was cool to have another car enthusiast around, but it soon became pretty clear that my dad was doing everything he could to bond with him, and that meant spending more time with them than with me. Recently, my dad's had a run of bad luck financially. He lost his job about a year back, and we've been living on a tight budget ever since. Even though I was working part-time to support myself, things were tight in the household, and Dad kept saying we all had to pitch in. Now, it's not like I minded helping out, it's just that things were already tense between us. He was spending more and more time with his new family, and honestly, it felt like I was just a background figure in his life these days. The car, though, that was still mine, and it was something I could hold on to. It was the one thing I had that reminded me of her, of family memories, weekend drives, and just her whole spirit. My plan was simple: save up enough money to fix it up, restore it, and eventually keep it as a family heirloom. But lately, it seemed like my new stepbrother was showing more than a passing interest in it. He'd ask me questions about classic cars, want to see the engine, and sometimes hang around in the garage just staring at it. I was happy to share details at first. I mean, he was just a kid who liked cars. But soon, my dad started dropping hints about some big surprise he was planning for my stepbrother. When I asked what it was, he'd just brush it off and say, "You'll see." Not long after that, I started noticing that small parts from the car were going missing. The emblem was gone one day, and another day, the leather steering wheel cover Mom had put on years ago was missing too. When I asked my dad about it, he brushed me off, saying I was overreacting and maybe I'd misplaced them. I knew that wasn't the case, though. I'd kept everything organized, and no one but my dad, stepmom, and stepbrother had been around. My gut told me something was off, and it wasn't just the parts going missing. At that point, I brought up my concerns to my extended family on my mom's side. They were the only people who really knew what that car meant to me, and when they heard about what was happening, they weren't happy either. My aunt, especially, felt like my dad was overstepping and taking away something that wasn't his to mess with. I tried talking to my stepmom about it too, thinking maybe she'd understand, but she was totally dismissive. She said I was just being dramatic and needed to let Dad and her son bond, even if it was through cars. With every day, my anxiety about the car grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, but I couldn't put my finger on what. My dad's remarks about moving on and letting go of old things only made it worse. He kept saying things like, "You can't live in the past forever," as if the car was just an old memory I was clinging to. But for me, it was so much more. That car was my last connection to my mom, to the family we had before all of this. Then one day, I came home and saw the driveway empty. The car was gone. My first thought was that Dad might have moved it, but after checking around the garage and finding no trace of it, I realized something had happened. I went straight to my dad, demanding to know where it was. And that's when he told me he'd sold it. Just like that, it was gone, and I had no idea where it went. Dad tried to make it sound like it was no big deal, as if he'd just cleaned out an old storage space. But to me, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That car was my mom's last gift to me, a piece of her that I thought was safe. Now it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me, and I didn't know what to do next. With no car and no clear answers, I stood there, my mind racing. And that was only the beginning of what would become a fight for something far bigger than just a vehicle. Update 1. After finding out the car was gone, I immediately went to my dad, demanding an explanation. I was hoping for some kind of rational reason, maybe even an apology, but what he told me left me stunned. He had sold it, just like that. When I asked him why he'd do something like that, his answer was simple. It was just sitting there. According to him, I wasn't doing anything with it anyway, so he thought selling it made sense. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad knew exactly what that car meant to me. He knew it was my mom's, that it was the last thing she'd ever given me. But instead of acknowledging any of that, he went on about how we all had to make sacrifices and contribute to his new life. I couldn't wrap my head around it. For years, I'd been talking about fixing it up, about making it a tribute to my mom. He knew all of that. And still, he went ahead and sold it without even mentioning it to me first. What made things worse was finding out what he did with the money. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The money from selling my mom's car had gone straight into buying a brand new car for my stepbrother, a flashy model that was way more expensive than anything I'd ever driven. When I saw it parked in the driveway, shining like some kind of trophy, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My dad had traded away the only thing left of my mom to buy his new Stepson a car, just so they could bond over it. Trying to make sense of it all, I reached out to my stepmom, thinking maybe she'd understand. But as soon as I started talking, she brushed it off as just a car. She even went as far as to say I should be happy my dad and her son were getting along. Apparently, my stepbrother had no clue about the whole backstory, and to him, it was just an awesome new car from his new stepdad. It stung, but there was nothing I could say that would make them understand. Frustrated, I went to my mom's side of the family. We have a group chat, and I needed to vent. As soon as I explained what happened, my phone blew up. My aunt was horrified, and my cousins were just as shocked. Half of them couldn't believe my dad would do something like this, while a few others tried to play devil's advocate, saying maybe he thought he was helping. Either way, the support from my mom's family was overwhelming. They knew what that car meant to me, and they were furious on my behalf. But at home, things were just getting worse. Dad gave me an ultimatum, telling me I needed to let go of the past and help him build his new family. He actually said that, like I was just supposed to forget everything and move on as if none of it mattered. Every time I tried to explain why the car was important, he'd cut me off or roll his eyes, saying I was just stuck in the past. For him, everything was about his new life, his new family, and I was supposed to get on board or get out of the way. Hearing about it, my aunt and a few other family members called me directly, shocked and saddened. They offered emotional support, and honestly, just having them back me up made a difference. They suggested I try to get the car back if I could, which led me to reach out to some old friends who knew about the car. One of them, an old buddy from high school who used to work on cars with me, offered to help however he could. His first thought was to contact the dealership where Dad had sold it and see if it was still available. I managed to track down the dealership, but they explained that it had already been sold to a private buyer. When I asked if there was any way to find out who bought it, they said their hands were tied. They sympathized, but once the sale was finalized, it was out of their control. It felt like I was hitting one wall after another. Desperate, I started checking out local listings online, hoping by some miracle I'd come across my mom's car. But then came the reality check. Even if I found it, I didn't have the money to buy it back. My savings, which I'd been putting aside for the car's restoration, wasn't nearly enough to repurchase it at market value. And of course, my dad was done helping me with anything that involved the car. With no way to get the money on my own, it felt like the car was slipping further and further out of reach. To add salt to the wound, my stepbrother, still clueless, sent me a message. He thanked Dad for the new car and went on about how great it was. It was a casual, friendly text, and he didn't know what had gone into buying it, but reading it made me sick. It felt like my mom's memory had been swapped out for something newer, shinier, and easier to share. Update 2. Days after my stepbrother's message, I was still scrambling for ways to get my mom's car back. I spent hours scrolling through online listings, hoping I'd come across it. And then, almost by luck, I spotted a listing that looked like it might be the one. Same make, model, and even the same minor dent on the back bumper, which felt like my last bit of confirmation. The only problem? It was listed for almost double what Dad had probably sold it for. My savings were nowhere near enough, but I wasn't giving up yet. When I shared the listing with a few family friends who knew the backstory, one of them suggested setting up a GoFundMe. I'd never done anything like that before, but with their encouragement, I figured I'd give it a shot. We wrote up the story, posted it online, and explained why the car meant so much to me. The plan was simple: raise enough money to buy back the car before someone else snatched it up. Once the GoFundMe was live, things started to take off. Donations came in, mostly small amounts, but a few family friends and some relatives chipped in larger amounts, saying they remembered the car from years back and wanted to help. The campaign gained traction fast, with people leaving supportive messages and sharing their own stories about sentimental items they'd lost or held onto. For the first time in a while, I felt a little more hopeful. But of course, it didn't take long for the backlash to start. A few strangers accused me of being materialistic, saying it was just an old car, and others said I was exploiting people's sympathy. Some of the comments were brutal. But the toughest blow came when my dad found out. He called me, furious that I'd put our private business online. According to him, the GoFundMe was an embarrassment to his new family, and he didn't hold back on letting me know how much damage he thought it was doing. Then, surprisingly, my stepbrother messaged me again. He sounded awkward but apologized, saying he didn't realize how much the car meant to me. But he also added that he wasn't giving up his new car, as it was a gift from my dad, and he didn't want to come between us. It was hard to be mad at him. He was just a kid who got caught up in a situation he probably didn't fully understand. I knew I needed to talk to Dad face to face, so I asked him to meet up, hoping we could work things out. When we sat down, though, he didn't seem interested in hearing me out. He kept saying I needed to grow up and move on. To him, this whole thing was just a phase I couldn't let go of. It was clear he wasn't budging, and honestly, I left that meeting feeling more defeated than ever. My stepmom wasn't any more supportive. She accused me of trying to sabotage their new family and said I was causing drama for no reason. She made it clear I wasn't welcome around until I sorted out my priorities. She didn't seem to understand, or maybe didn't care, how important this was to me. A few days later, I was cleaning up my room and found an old note my mom had left in one of her things. It was small and folded up, just a little message telling me to always take care of what matters. Finding that note felt like a spark reigniting the motivation I needed. No way was I going to let this go. Since the GoFundMe wasn't enough to reach the listing price alone, I started picking up extra work wherever I could. It wasn't easy juggling multiple jobs, but every dollar was a step closer. On top of that, more people reached out with messages of support. Strangers who'd come across the campaign, even some old family friends, sent notes sharing their stories and telling me to keep pushing forward. Reading those messages made me feel like I had an entire community backing me up, even if things were tense at home. After a while, I noticed Dad was starting to avoid me around the house. He'd leave the room whenever I walked in, and he rarely looked me in the eye. Maybe he felt a little guilty, but he wasn't about to admit it or apologize. It was a strange, unspoken tension, but it was clear he wasn't going to support me. Just when I thought I was making some headway with funds, I got a tip from a family member that there might be another dealership with leads on the car. I called them up, but it turned out to be a dead end. The dealership hadn't seen the car, and they couldn't offer any help. It felt like another roadblock, but I wasn't ready to give up. One of my cousins suggested therapy, saying it might help me process everything and maybe even understand Dad's side of things. That only added fuel to the fire at home, as my dad and stepmom caught wind of it and used it as more evidence that I was blowing things out of proportion. They both seemed convinced that I was making this a way bigger deal than it was. Finally, a potential buyer emerged, someone who'd bought the car but was open to selling it, though only at a high price. They didn't care about the story or why I wanted it back, they were just in it for the profit. But the lead gave me something to hold on to. I doubled down, telling myself I'd do whatever it took to get the car back, no matter how long it took. Every time I looked at that listing, I reminded myself of the promise I'd made to Mom to take care of what mattered. No matter how hard it got, I was determined to bring that car back home. Update 3. After weeks of trying to get in touch, I finally reached the buyer who'd purchased my mom's car. Right from the start, he wasn't exactly warm or willing to negotiate. To him, the car was just another transaction, something he'd bought with the plan to flip it for a profit. He told me he'd only be willing to sell it if I met his price, which was steep. Even after hearing the story, he didn't budge. Sentimental value didn't factor into his bottom line. Around this time, a mechanic I knew reached out after seeing the GoFundMe. He'd worked with my mom a few times when she owned the car and remembered it well. He offered to check the car's condition once I could retrieve it, just to make sure there wasn't any serious damage or hidden issues. Having someone on my side who understood the car's history and was willing to help brought some relief. I knew the car would need a lot of work, and getting it back in shape would take more than just money. At home, Dad's attitude seemed to shift in a strange way. He started acting as if everything was normal, like nothing had happened. He'd ask about my job, mention little things about his day, and try to include me in conversations with the family, ignoring the elephant in the room. My stepbrother, on the other hand, had started to notice the tension, especially when he saw me working long hours and constantly checking my phone for updates on the fundraiser. He'd catch my eye sometimes when Dad brought up family bonding stuff, looking a bit uncomfortable. Then, one night, I saw the GoFundMe hit the halfway mark. Family members and even a few old friends had pitched in more, leaving encouraging messages. The support was humbling, and it gave me the boost I needed to keep pushing forward. My mom's side of the family even stepped in, saying they'd cover part of the remaining amount. They were worried about the strain this was putting on everyone, and it felt like they were trying to help make things right. With a bigger chunk of funds gathered, I went back to the buyer for another round of negotiation. This time, he was a little more receptive, but he still wouldn't lower the price much. He finally agreed to sell, but he kept the cost high, making sure he got his profit. It was still tough to accept, but at least the car was within reach now. Just as I thought things were finally settling, Dad pulled me aside one night and demanded I take down the GoFundMe. According to him, the public drama was affecting his reputation and embarrassing the family. He wanted me to stop talking about the situation and suggested I should be grateful for his generosity in buying my stepbrother a car in the first place. I pushed back, reminding him that my mom's car meant more to me than his image, and the argument got heated. Later that evening, my stepbrother came to me, looking nervous. He apologized for how everything had gone down, saying he hadn't realized how much the car meant to me until he saw what I was going through. Then he surprised me by offering to help with some of his own savings. I could see he genuinely wanted to make things right, but part of me was still resentful. Even so, I accepted his offer. It was hard to separate my feelings, but I knew this was his way of trying to repair what he could. With his help and the money from my family, I finally had enough to meet the buyer's price. We arranged to meet in person to make the exchange. The morning of the meeting, I felt like everything was moving in slow motion. When I got there, the buyer barely acknowledged me, handing over the keys after I transferred the funds. It didn't matter, I had my mom's car back. But when I saw the car up close, it was rougher than I'd expected. The paint was chipped in spots, and the engine sounded strained. It was clear the car hadn't been treated well in the time it was gone. It hurt to see it like that, but knowing I had it back made all the effort worth it. I ran my hands along the hood, remembering all the times I'd sat in the passenger seat with my mom. It felt like getting a part of her back, even if the car needed a lot of care to get it back to its former state. Back home, reactions were mixed. Dad and my stepmom weren't happy. They thought the whole situation had turned into unnecessary drama, claiming I'd taken things too far. But my stepbrother surprised me by showing genuine interest. He even asked if he could help me work on the restoration, saying he wanted to understand why the car was so important. It was a strange moment, him standing there, offering to learn about a history he wasn't a part of. But I decided to let him. If he was willing to learn, I'd let him in, if only a little. With the car now parked back in the driveway, I felt a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't just a car. It was my connection to my mom, my memories, and the life we'd shared. I didn't know what the road ahead would bring, but having that piece of my past back felt like a step toward the future, one I could face on my terms. Update 4. With the car finally back in my possession, I didn't waste any time getting to work. The car was in rough shape, way worse than I'd expected, but seeing it up close again reminded me of all the memories attached to it. The first thing I did was reach out to a few family friends and people from the GoFundMe who'd offered to help with parts, labor, or advice. Their support was immediate. A couple of them dropped by to check out the car and offered some parts they had lying around, which would save a lot on costs. Not long into the restoration process, my stepbrother came up to me in the garage. He'd been keeping his distance since everything went down, but now he looked uneasy. He offered a real apology, saying he hadn't understood the depth of it all at first. He even admitted that he felt responsible for what had happened, even though I told him it wasn't on him. He'd just been caught in the middle. Over time, he started coming out to the garage more, asking questions about the restoration process and offering to help where he could. Meanwhile, my dad's frustration over the attention kept growing. He complained that the whole thing was making a scene and pulling unwanted attention to our family. His frustration turned into anger, especially when people from Mom's side of the family stopped talking to him altogether. My aunt and cousins were particularly disappointed, expressing outright disapproval of how he disregarded something that meant so much to me. Dad's new family was his focus, but Mom's side of the family had always had my back, and this situation only reinforced that divide. My stepmom didn't hold back either. She pulled me aside and laid it out. If I wanted to be a part of this family, I'd have to let go of the past. According to her, all the drama around the car was an embarrassment to Dad and was making it hard for everyone to move forward. The way she framed it, I was the one holding on to old things and clinging to memories, making things difficult for everyone else. In those hours spent working on the car, I found a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. My mom had taught me basic mechanics on this very car when I was younger, showing me how to change oil and replace spark plugs. Every bolt I turned, and every part one replaced brought those memories flooding back, and in a strange way, it felt like reconnecting with her. I wasn't just fixing the car, I was piecing together a part of my life I thought had been taken away forever. Meanwhile, word of the story kept spreading online. More people reached out, some strangers sharing their own stories of sentimental heirlooms and lost items that had meaning far beyond their material value. These messages were overwhelming at times, but they strengthened my resolve to keep going. People understood the car wasn't just an old vehicle, it was a link to a person I loved. One night, I got a private message from my dad. He claimed I'd made him look bad by sharing everything so publicly. He wanted a public apology for the embarrassment I'd caused. I took a long time before replying, realizing that I might never get the kind of support I wanted from him. That night, I decided to keep a respectful distance from him emotionally. I'd wasted too much energy hoping he'd come around, and it was clear his priorities were different now. My stepbrother, though, started showing genuine interest in the restoration. He joined me in the garage, asking about my mom and the car's history. At first, it was strange having him there, considering everything that had happened. But as he asked questions, I saw he was trying to learn, to understand, and to bridge some of the distance between us. Slowly, I let him help with small tasks, and over time, he became part of the project. During one of our sessions, I discovered a hidden compartment under the passenger seat. Inside, I found some of my mom's old things, small trinkets, a few faded photos, and a note folded carefully. The note was simple but heartfelt, just a reminder from her to keep taking care of what's precious. Finding those keepsakes made the restoration feel even more significant. It was like my mom had left me a reminder, knowing someday I'd need it. As the car took shape, I started planning a tribute once it was fully restored. I wanted to hold a small gathering to share the car's final reveal with everyone who'd supported me. It wasn't just for me, it was a way to honor my mom, to show my gratitude to the people who'd helped, and to celebrate what this car truly represented. I shared the plan with my family, inviting them to join, though I kept my expectations low. When my stepmom found out, she confronted me again, accusing me of tearing the family apart. To her, I was being selfish, stuck on a memory that was holding everyone back. It was clear that my attachment to the car, to my mom, clashed with her vision of a unified family under her and Dad's direction. I realized then that my dad's new life with her would always overshadow any respect for my history with my mom, and I decided right then to hold on to my memories in my own way, regardless of their approval. The car was more than just a machine, it was a piece of who I was, of who my mom was, and no one could take that from me. As the final pieces of the restoration came together, I felt ready for whatever was next. I knew my mom would have been proud of what I'd done, and I was finally at peace with moving forward, on my own terms. Update 5. Life. After months of hard work, the car was finally complete. It looked almost brand new, every detail lovingly restored, from the paint job to the last bolt on the engine. I stood back, taking in the result, a beautiful tribute to my mom, brought back to life through the support of friends, family, and even strangers online who understood why it meant so much. But I wanted to celebrate this milestone with everyone who had helped me get there, so I planned a small gathering at a local park. I invited family, friends, and even a few people from Mom's side who'd offered their support along the way. The day of the gathering was perfect, the sky clear, a soft breeze in the air. I parked the car in a spot where everyone could see it and arranged a few old photos of my mom with the car beside it as a reminder of what this was all about. Friends arrived, some of them bringing parts they'd donated or photos of us working on the car together. I was touched when I saw a few aunts, uncles, and cousins from Mom's side. They'd brought more photos, and a few even shared stories of my mom and the car from back in the day, stories I hadn't heard before. My stepbrother came too, and I could tell he was genuinely impressed. He walked around the car, taking in every detail, and then came over saying he finally understood why I'd gone to such lengths to bring it back. His respect felt real, like he'd really grasped the importance of what we'd achieved. Dad showed up as well, though he stayed on the edge of the gathering, looking a bit out of place. He watched quietly, clearly aware of how much this meant, but uncomfortable with the attention the car was drawing. My stepmom hovered nearby, clearly not happy with the whole scene, and when she finally spoke up, she tried to downplay the whole situation, saying things had been blown out of proportion. But it didn't go over well. Several family members, including those from my mom's side, stood by me, making it clear they supported what I'd done to honor her memory. Even friends who didn't know the full story picked up on the tension, and it was clear I wasn't the only one frustrated by her attitude. At one point, my grandfather, the family elder, stepped forward and pulled Dad and my stepmom aside. He told them, plain and simple, that they needed to respect my connection to the car and my mom's memory. He wasn't harsh, but his words carried weight, reminding them that this wasn't just a car but a link to the past. I could see my dad struggling to process everything, like he was caught between his new life and the legacy he'd let slip through his fingers. Then something surprising happened. My stepbrother offered to help me maintain the car in the future. He suggested we could even work on small car projects together, making the car something we could bond over rather than letting it remain a point of tension. I could see he was trying to make things right in his own way, and for the first time, I felt like we might actually have a shot at building a relationship that wasn't just based on shared space in a house. Toward the end of the gathering, Dad pulled me aside. For the first time since everything began, he gave a heartfelt apology. He admitted he'd let his relationship with my stepmom cloud his judgment, and that he should have respected what the car meant to me. He promised he'd try to be more considerate of my feelings and the parts of my life that mattered, even if they didn't fit into his new world. We stood there, words hanging in the air between us. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and it gave me a sliver of hope that maybe someday things could be better between us. As people started to leave, I felt a quiet sense of closure. The car wasn't just a reminder of my mom anymore. It was a symbol of everything I'd fought for, my memories, my independence, and my right to hold on to the parts of my life that mattered. Extended family members from my mom's side came up to me, expressing their pride. They told me they were glad I'd stood up for what I believed in, affirming that I'd done the right thing by honoring her memory, regardless of the fallout. Later that night, I shared a few photos of the restored car and the tribute gathering on social media. Almost instantly, messages flooded in from people who had followed the journey. Some congratulated me, while others shared similar stories about heirlooms or memories they'd fought to keep. The outpouring of support reminded me of just how many people understood that some things were more than just objects. They were connections to the past, to people we loved and lost. In the following weeks, my stepbrother and I started working on a few smaller projects in the garage. It was a quiet, unspoken agreement to keep the peace, and slowly we found a rhythm. We didn't have to say much, just working side by side was enough to start building something new. It was strange, but it felt like we were both learning how to let go of past resentment, trading it for a sense of understanding. Looking back, I realized this whole journey had changed me. I'd reclaimed a part of my life that had almost been lost and proven to myself that I had the strength to stand up for what mattered, no matter how tough it got. The car, my mom's memory, and even the new relationship I was forming with my stepbrother had all become symbols of a future I could embrace, one built on my own terms. I wasn't just holding on to the past, I was carrying it forward, using it to shape the person I was becoming, and in a way, that was the best tribute to my mom I could imagine. I'm a 29-year-old guy, the oldest of 3 siblings. My brother is 26, and my sister is 22. Growing up, it was always pretty obvious who the favorite child was. My sister could do no wrong in our dad's eyes. It wasn't blatant favoritism at first, but as we got older, the patterns became impossible to ignore. I remember one Christmas when I was about 12. We all opened our presents together, and while my brother and I got decent gifts, a gaming console we had to share, my sister got her own dollhouse, a matching furniture set, and a ton of accessories to go with it. Dad kept calling her his princess while my brother and I exchanged looks. It wasn't just the gifts, though. She got more attention, more praise, and, as we grew up, fewer expectations. Fast forward to today. I'm a graphic designer and live on my own, about an hour away from my parents. My brother is working in tech and lives with his girlfriend. My sister, though, she's still at home with my parents, doesn't have a job, and contributes nothing financially. My dad doesn't seem to mind. He's always doting on her, calling her his baby, while my brother and I just shake our heads. A couple of months ago, my sister announced she was engaged to her boyfriend of 4 years. Everyone was thrilled for her. Don't get me wrong, I was happy too, but I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. Knowing my dad, I figured he'd want to go all out for her wedding. I just didn't realize how far he'd take it. During one of our family dinners, my sister started talking about her dream wedding. She was casually throwing around ideas about a huge venue, designer dresses, and live entertainment. At first, I thought she was just daydreaming. Then she turned to my dad and said, "Of course you'll pay for everything, right? It's only $100,000 or so." I thought he'd laugh it off or at least tell her it was too much. Instead, he hesitated, mumbled something about it being a lot of money, and then nodded. Just like that, he agreed. I sat there in disbelief. $100,000? For a wedding? Meanwhile, my brother and I were expected to figure out our own lives with minimal financial help. Later that night, I confronted him about it. My brother was on the same page as me. We felt it was unfair. Not just the amount of money, but how it was being handled. My dad brushed us off, saying we were being selfish and that it was his money to spend as he pleased. When we asked if this meant our inheritance would be affected, he got defensive, saying we should support the family and that my sister deserved the wedding because she's the youngest. My sister didn't help matters. When we tried to bring up the issue with her, she acted like she was the victim. She called us jealous and said it wasn't her fault that dad wanted to spoil her. She even threw in a line about how being the youngest meant she should be treated differently. The final straw came when my brother did some digging and found out that our dad was planning to cut back on what he'd promised us for our futures. He admitted that part of our inheritance might go toward covering the wedding costs. My brother was livid. He told Dad straight up that if the inheritance was cut, he wouldn't be attending the wedding. Meanwhile, my mom stayed mostly quiet. She looked uncomfortable but didn't say much, which isn't surprising. She's always deferred to Dad when it comes to major decisions, even when she doesn't agree. The tension in the family has been building ever since. My brother and I started keeping our distance. Family dinners have turned awkward, and conversations feel forced. My sister, on the other hand, is acting like nothing's wrong. She's fully immersed in wedding planning, throwing out phrases like the event of the century and talking about how everything needs to be perfect. I don't know what the future holds, but one thing's for sure, this isn't going to end well. My brother and I are tired of being treated as second-class family members. If Dad wants to play favorites, fine, but he can't expect us to sit quietly while he burns through money meant for all of us to fund one person's dream wedding. Update 1. The wedding planning kicked off at full speed, and it quickly became a circus. My sister wasn't holding back on anything. She wanted the biggest venue in town, a live band, a 5-course meal, and decorations that looked like they belonged in a royal palace. There was no talk of budgeting or scaling back. Everything had to be perfect, no matter the cost. Within a week, she had booked multiple appointments with wedding planners, dress designers, and caterers. Every conversation seemed to start with, "Dad will take care of it." Meanwhile, my brother and I started to notice small changes. My dad seemed tense, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with short answers and long sighs. That's when my brother dropped the bombshell during one of our calls. He had overheard our dad discussing the possibility of taking out a loan. The idea that my dad, who had always been cautious with money, was considering a loan to fund this extravaganza was mind-blowing. I started digging. I knew enough about our family's finances to sense when things didn't add up. A few quiet phone calls later, I confirmed it. My dad had already spoken to a bank about refinancing our family home. I brought this to my brother, and we knew we couldn't sit quietly anymore. A friend suggested we consult a financial advisor, someone neutral who could lay out the risks in black and white. The advisor confirmed our fears. If my dad continued on this path, he wouldn't just cut into our inheritance, he could jeopardize his retirement and even lose the house. We decided it was time to confront him together. When we brought it up, it didn't go as planned. My sister must have overheard us talking because not long after, she made a scene. Tears, accusations, the whole works. She claimed we were trying to sabotage her wedding and didn't want her to be happy. My dad, of course, jumped to her defense. Suddenly, my brother and I were the villains in this family drama. My dad called for a family meeting. He stood at the head of the table, with my mom sitting quietly beside him, looking uncomfortable. He laid into us, accusing us of being unsupportive and selfish. My brother tried to reason with him, bringing up the financial risks, but it was like talking to a wall. My dad waved it off, insisting it was his money and his decision. The tension in the room was unbearable. Then, my mom broke down. She started crying, saying she felt stuck and powerless. It was the first time I'd seen her openly express how much this was affecting her. But even then, she didn't directly oppose my dad. She just looked at us with pleading eyes, as if hoping we'd back down to keep the peace. My brother, fed up, issued an ultimatum. He told my dad that if he went through with cutting into our inheritance for the wedding, he wouldn't attend. My dad didn't even flinch. He simply said it was my brother's choice. That was when my brother started to pull away. He stopped answering group texts and skipped the next few family dinners. Meanwhile, my sister was escalating. She threw a tantrum because the designer dress she wanted wasn't available in her size, demanding that Dad pay extra to have one custom made. When that didn't happen immediately, she sulked and refused to talk to anyone for days. I decided to consult a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision, but I needed to know if there was any way to protect what was left of our inheritance. The lawyer explained that since the money was technically my dad's, there wasn't much we could do unless he was proven to be acting irresponsibly to the point of endangering his own financial stability. It was a long shot, but at least I had some clarity. When I brought up the lawyer's advice to my dad, hoping it might make him reconsider, he doubled down. He dismissed it as unnecessary and accused me of meddling. My sister, of course, heard about it and spun the story to make me look like I was plotting against her. The family tension kept building, and it felt like every day brought a new argument or accusation. At this point, I've decided I'll attend the wedding, but not without making a statement. My brother, however, has completely withdrawn. He's done. He hasn't spoken to my dad in weeks, and I don't blame him. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I discovered something else. My dad had secretly sold an old piece of family property to cover part of the costs. This wasn't just any property, it was something he had promised to pass down to us one day. Finding that out felt like a punch to the gut. The wedding is still months away, but the damage is already done. The resentment is growing, the family dynamic is toxic, and I can't help but wonder what's next. Whatever happens, I don't think any of us will come out of this unscathed. Update 2. The property sale wasn't the only secret my dad had been keeping. A few days after I found out about it, my brother called me, fuming. He just learned that Dad had sold a family heirloom, a vintage watch that belonged to our grandfather, to cover some of the wedding costs. The watch wasn't just a collectible, it was something our grandfather had worn every day. It was supposed to be passed down to my brother, who had always been closer to him. When I asked how he found out, my brother explained that an uncle mentioned seeing the watch listed at a local auction house. Apparently, Dad had been trying to keep it quiet. but word got out and extended family members started talking. I could hear the frustration in my brother's voice as he described how much the watch meant to him. He wasn't just angry, he felt betrayed. It didn't take long for the rest of the family to catch wind of the sale. At a family gathering, one of our aunts pulled me aside and asked what was going on. She said she couldn't believe my dad would sell something so important just for a wedding. Soon, the whispers started turning into full-blown conversations, and it became clear that my dad's decision wasn't sitting well with anyone. Even relatives who usually stayed out of family drama were questioning his judgment. Meanwhile, my sister brushed it all off. She waved away the complaints, saying the watch was just an object and that it wasn't a big deal. It was like she didn't care about the history or meaning behind it. Instead, she focused on her wedding plans, acting like nothing else mattered. Around this time, I noticed her fiancé looking more and more uncomfortable. At first, he seemed supportive of her extravagant plans, but now it was clear he was having second thoughts. During a brief chat, he admitted to me that the wedding was spiraling out of control. He didn't want to upset my sister, but he wasn't on board with the lavish spending either. Still, he seemed hesitant to say anything, probably afraid of how she'd react. Frustrated, I vented to a small group of close friends. I told them about the property sale, the heirloom, and how the wedding was driving a wedge through the family. They listened patiently, and one of them suggested that my brother and I needed to take a stand, not just for ourselves but for the family's future. It was solid advice, but easier said than done. As the wedding day crept closer, tensions continued to rise. My sister's demands were getting more outrageous. She wanted a designer dress flown in from another country, custom floral arrangements, and a choreographed fireworks show. Every time my dad tried to push back, she would sulk or cry until he caved. Watching it all unfold felt like watching a slow-motion train wreck. In a rare quiet moment, my mom opened up to me. She admitted she didn't agree with what was happening but felt trapped. She said that while she supported my dad's decisions publicly, she secretly sided with my brother and me. She also revealed that she'd been quietly putting aside a small amount of money to make sure we weren't left with nothing. It wasn't long before my brother and I decided we needed to confront our sister directly. Talking to my dad clearly wasn't working. When we brought up our concerns, she didn't even try to listen. Instead, she accused us of trying to ruin her happiness. She stormed off, leaving us standing there, wondering if we'd made things worse. Her fiancé approached me later. He told me he understood where we were coming from and even agreed with some of our points, but he also said he didn't know how to handle my sister without causing a fight. It was obvious he was walking on eggshells, trying to keep the peace while avoiding a full-blown argument. At this point, the family divide was impossible to ignore. Some relatives sided with my brother and me, agreeing that the wedding had gone too far. Others defended my dad, saying it was his money and his choice. The constant back and forth left everyone on edge, and family gatherings became tense and awkward. Then I found out about another financial sacrifice. My dad had dipped into his retirement savings to pay for the wedding venue deposit. This was the final straw for me. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about how far my dad was willing to go to keep my sister happy, no matter the cost. The wedding countdown was in full swing, but I was seriously considering skipping it altogether. My brother had already made up his mind not to go, and I couldn't blame him. The resentment was building, and the family dynamic was becoming more toxic by the day. With every passing week, it felt like my dad was digging the family into a deeper hole, all to appease one person. Whatever happens at this wedding, it's clear there's no going back to how things were before. Update 3. The wedding day arrived, and it was every bit as over the top as my sister had dreamed. The venue was a sprawling estate, complete with a grand staircase, crystal chandeliers, and floral arrangements that must have cost as much as a car. Guests were greeted by servers in tuxedos offering champagne. My brother had already decided not to attend, but I went, more out of obligation than anything else. As I walked into the reception area, it felt like stepping onto the set of a high-budget movie. My sister, in her custom-made designer dress, looked like she was starring in it. She was radiant, sure, but the whole thing felt excessive. There were ice sculptures, a live band, and even a chocolate fountain. It was hard not to think about the cost of it all. The ceremony itself went smoothly, but as the reception kicked off, the tension started bubbling just below the surface. I kept a low profile, sticking to the edges of the room and avoiding my dad. My mom was doing the same, though she looked exhausted, like she'd been holding in too much for too long. Things took a turn during the toasts. My dad gave a long, emotional speech about how proud he was of my sister and how she deserved everything she'd ever wanted. The guests clapped and cheered, but I noticed a few relatives exchanging glances. My mom, seated at the table beside him, didn't join in the applause. As the night went on, the situation escalated. During the father-daughter dance, my dad made a point to mention how much he'd sacrificed to give her this day. It felt like a jab, a subtle way of justifying everything to the extended family. After the dance, I decided I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I approached my dad during a quieter moment, pulling him aside near the bar. My brother had texted me earlier, urging me to at least try to get him to see reason, so I laid everything out, again. I brought up the heirloom, the property, and the retirement savings. My dad brushed it off, saying it was all worth it for my sister's happiness. At that moment, my mom stepped in. She didn't hold back this time. In front of several relatives, she admitted she disagreed with the spending from the start. She said she'd stayed silent for the sake of peace but couldn't do it anymore. My dad looked stunned, like he hadn't expected her to speak up. The argument quickly grew louder, drawing attention from nearby tables. Guests started whispering, and a few even got up to see what was happening. My sister noticed the commotion and stormed over, demanding to know why we were ruining her big day. She accused us of being jealous and ungrateful, which only added fuel to the fire. Her fiancé, who had been trying to keep his distance all night, finally stepped in. He looked fed up and asked everyone to calm down, but it was too late. The scene had escalated into a full-blown spectacle. My dad turned his frustration on me, accusing my brother and me of being selfish and only caring about the money. By this point, the band had stopped playing, and all eyes were on us. One of my aunts tried to mediate, but my sister wasn't having it. She burst into tears, claiming that no one supported her and that we were all trying to ruin her happiness. It was like a soap opera playing out in real life. Her fiancé, clearly embarrassed, walked out of the room. He didn't make a big scene, but his departure spoke volumes. My mom, who had been holding it together as best as she could, finally broke down. She walked out too, leaving my dad standing there, red-faced and furious. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my coat and left without saying goodbye. On the way out, I texted my brother to let him know what had happened. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed to hear how bad it had gotten. We agreed that this wedding had officially marked the breaking point for our family. In the days that followed, the fallout became clear. My dad called me once, not to apologize, but to warn me that if my brother and I didn't change our attitudes, he'd cut us out of his will entirely. I told him to do whatever he thought was best and hung up. On the flip side, some extended family members started reaching out to support my brother and me. A few aunts and uncles even confronted my dad directly, telling him they thought he'd gone too far. It was comforting to know we weren't entirely alone in this. As for my sister, she seemed blissfully unaware of the damage that had been done. She posted pictures from the wedding all over social media, captioning them with phrases like "best day ever" and "family love." The irony wasn't lost on me. My brother and I made a pact to focus on our own lives from now on. He's doing well in his new job, and I'm considering moving further away to put some real distance between us and this mess. The family we knew is gone, replaced by resentment and broken relationships. If my dad and sister want to live in their bubble, they can. I'm done trying to fix it. Update 4. Not long after the wedding fiasco, my dad followed through on his threat. A lawyer's letter arrived, informing me that my brother and I had been formally removed from the will. It didn't come as a shock, but seeing it in writing still hit hard. My brother got the same letter and called me, his voice calm but distant. He told me he was done, not just with my dad, but with the entire family dynamic. A week later, he packed up and moved to another city, cutting all ties. The split in the family became more apparent. Some relatives sided with my dad and sister, defending their actions as a father just wanting the best for his daughter. Others, however, reached out to me and my brother privately, expressing their disappointment in how things had unfolded. Aunts and uncles started skipping family gatherings, unwilling to take sides in the growing divide. As if the wedding hadn't caused enough drama, my sister added fuel to the fire from her honeymoon. She called my mom, sobbing about how she felt attacked at her own wedding and demanded apologies from everyone who had ruined her big day. My mom, caught in the middle, tried to placate her without pointing fingers. When she relayed the conversation to me, I could only shake my head. I refused to play along with my sister's narrative. Around this time, I started hearing rumors about my dad's financial situation. A distant cousin mentioned seeing him at a local bank, looking stressed. Another relative hinted that he might have taken out another loan, this time to help cover some of the post-wedding bills. When I asked my mom, she admitted she wasn't sure but said she'd noticed him avoiding discussions about money. My sister, meanwhile, wasn't done making demands. She started talking about buying a new house with her husband and mentioned expecting my dad to help with the down payment. I heard this through one of our cousins who seemed as baffled as I was. Her entitlement was relentless, and her husband's patience seemed to be wearing thin. From what I gathered, their arguments were becoming more frequent, with him pushing back against her extravagant expectations. It didn't take long for my dad's health to start showing the strain. My mom confided that he'd been experiencing frequent headaches and high blood pressure, but he refused to see a doctor. She said he seemed worn down, but he wouldn't admit that the financial and emotional toll of the wedding had anything to do with it. While my dad was struggling, my brother was thriving. He sent me updates about his new job, describing how much he enjoyed the fresh start. It was refreshing to hear him talk about something positive for a change. He didn't mention our dad or sister once, and I didn't bring them up either. It was clear he was happier now that he'd distanced himself from the chaos. My mom reached out to me a few times, asking if I'd consider reconciling for the sake of the family. I listened but didn't make any promises. I told her that any reconciliation would require my dad and sister to acknowledge the unfair treatment and the damage it had caused. She didn't argue, but I could tell she was holding out hope. In the meantime, my sister took to social media, posting pictures from the honeymoon and captioning them with dramatic statements like, "Survived the most challenging family drama, but love always wins." She painted herself as the victim, gaining sympathy from friends who didn't know the full story. It was infuriating to see, but I decided not to engage. The final straw came when I discovered my dad had sold another piece of property, one that was supposed to be a future inheritance for my brother and me. It wasn't as valuable as the family property he'd sold before, but it was still significant. When I confronted my mom about it, she confirmed it was true. She said my dad was using the money to pay off some of the wedding debts. Hearing that felt like a breaking point. At this stage, the damage feels irreparable. My dad and sister have dug themselves into their version of reality, where everything they've done is justified. My brother has moved on, and I'm starting to think I should do the same. My mom's quiet attempts to keep the family together feel increasingly futile. For now, I'm focusing on my own life. The ties that held us together as a family have frayed to the point of breaking, and I don't see how we can repair them. If my dad and sister want to keep living in denial, that's their choice. I'm done trying to save a family that doesn't seem to want to save itself. Update 5. A month after my dad's latest property sale, I got a call I wasn't expecting. It was my sister. Her voice was shaky, and within moments, she was crying. She told me her marriage was already on the rocks. Apparently, her husband had reached his breaking point. After months of her demands and expectations, he'd given her an ultimatum. Either she stopped relying on my dad for money and took responsibility for herself, or he was moving out. It wasn't hard to believe, considering how much tension I'd seen between them at the wedding and afterward. The conversation caught me off guard. For years, my sister had acted untouchable, always backed by my dad and shielded from the consequences of her actions. Now, she was admitting things weren't as perfect as she'd made them seem. She asked if I thought she was at fault, but I avoided answering directly. The truth was obvious to everyone except her. Not long after that call, word got out that my dad had confided in one of our uncles about the financial mess he'd created. Apparently, he admitted that funding the wedding was a mistake but couldn't bring himself to say it directly to me or my brother. My uncle relayed this to a few other family members, who then reached out to my dad, urging him to fix things before it was too late. Around the same time, my mom dropped a surprising revelation. During a quiet conversation, she told me she'd been secretly setting aside money for years, knowing my dad's favoritism could eventually leave me and my brother with nothing. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to give us a safety net. Hearing this made me appreciate how much my mom had been quietly dealing with, even if she hadn't openly taken a stand. Then, the family intervention happened. One of my aunts organized a meeting, calling everyone together under the pretense of a family discussion. My dad, sister, and I were all in the same room for the first time since the wedding. My brother joined via video call, looking as detached as ever. The atmosphere was tense from the start. My dad started defensively, listing all the things he'd done for the family over the years and brushing off the wedding fallout as a minor issue. My sister blamed everyone but herself, saying we'd blown things out of proportion and that she deserved her dream wedding. My brother, always direct, cut in and stated clearly that there would be no reconciliation unless my dad acknowledged the favoritism and made genuine changes. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid out everything: the unequal treatment, the financial sacrifices, and how it had fractured the family. I emphasized that this wasn't just about money, it was about fairness and respect. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Even my dad, who always had a rebuttal, seemed at a loss for words. Eventually, my dad offered a partial apology. He admitted that he'd been unfair at times, but stopped short of taking full responsibility. He promised to review his decisions, including the will, but it felt more like a way to pacify us than a genuine effort to change. My sister, on the other hand, refused to budge. She doubled down, insisting she'd done nothing wrong and that her wedding was worth every penny. Her denial didn't surprise me, but it cemented how disconnected she was from reality. As the meeting wrapped up, my brother made one final statement: he wouldn't reconcile or return to family events unless he saw meaningful changes. Then he logged off, leaving the rest of us sitting in awkward silence. A week later, I heard through my mom that my dad had started making changes to his will, though I didn't hold my breath for anything drastic. My sister's situation took a sharper turn when her husband temporarily moved out, saying he needed space to clear his head. The message was clear: her actions were catching up with her, and for once, Dad couldn't shield her from the fallout. For my part, I've made my boundaries clear. I'm open to repairing my relationship with my dad, but only if he shows that he's willing to treat everyone equally moving forward. I've also decided to keep my distance from my sister until she takes responsibility for her actions, if that ever happens. The family has reached a fragile truce, but the damage isn't fully repaired. Some relatives still tiptoe around the issue, while others are firmly on my brother's and my side. My mom continues to play the role of mediator, though I can see how much it's weighing on her. As for me, I'm focusing on my own happiness. This entire ordeal has taught me the importance of setting boundaries and not letting family drama consume my life. Whether or not things improve, I know I've done my part to stand up for what's right. The rest is up to them.